Greetings and bienvenido. Thank you for returning to another night for another Greentext. If you're new, then welcome to the channel. If you enjoy the broadcast, then please feel free to subscribe.
Typing as I go, sorry if it's a bit slow. Let me preface this story by telling you that it's been a long time since this happened. While it is a true story, I've had to add some details to make the story now in a somewhat coherent fashion, because I don't remember absolutely everything that happened. Also, my sequence of events may be a little fucked up, but that doesn't change the fact that some of these images are still absolutely frozen in my mind. I was hoping my old retelling was still around because it came out pretty coherent. Anyhow, when I was somewhere around 8 to 10 years old, I went camping with my Girl Scout troop. There were about 12 to 15 of us girls and 2 female leaders. The camp had 6 of those permanent tents, wooden platform with canvas covering and bunks. 3 to 4 were facing the main part of the camp, 2 were set back a bit in the woods behind the picnic shelter. Behind those 2 tents was a path that led to the latrines. On the first day, we all picked out our sleeping spots, and our tent was 1 girl short. We spent the rest of the afternoon and evening doing typical Girl Scout stuff, and we spent the evening around the fire singing and eating marshmallows. The counselors finally made us go to bed around 10 p.m. When we got to our tent, we used our flashlights to find our bunks and get settled in. It was around this time that we noticed that someone was sleeping in what had been the empty bunk. We didn't think much of this as it wasn't really unusual for someone to arrive at camp later than the main group, and some of the girls had gone back to their tents before the fire time was over because they were tired. I am a total insomniac, and it's even worse if I'm not in my own bed. This was true even back then. I tossed and turned trying to force myself to fall asleep that night, but it just wasn't happening. After doing this for over an hour, I heard the springs of one of the other beds squeak like someone was getting on. I turned my head to see someone standing up from that previously empty cot. In the very low light, I could just make out the figure of someone standing, pausing for a moment, and then moving toward the front entrance of the tent. The person opened the flap and left the tent. I figured that somebody just needed to go to the bathroom. I still couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd wait and see if I could tell who the girl was when she got back. I waited and waited, but I finally drifted off to sleep before the girl came back. When we woke the next morning, we discovered that the bed was empty, and there were no blankets or suitcases near the bed. We talked to the other girls to try to figure out who had been in our tent, but we found out that nobody had come in late, and nobody was missing from their tents. Still, there's always a chance that one of the girls got pissed off at the other girls in their tent and decided to switch for the night. That shit always happens with girls. That night we spent a long time around the campfire again. At some point during the evening, one of the girls stands up and starts walking toward the woods. The tents and shelter were in the opposite direction. As she got close to the tree line, one of the counselors called out to her to see what the heck she was doing, but she just kept walking straight into the woods. The counselor called to her another time and then went after her. The other counselor did a head count to try to figure out who was missing. When she got to the end, she stared at us and started counting again. The other counselor came back saying she couldn't see where the girl had gone, and she needed the bigger flashlight. When she asked who was missing, the counselor who had been trying to count us said, "Nobody." The counselors even pulled out the roster to check us off, but we were all right there. We were all a little shaken up, so the counselors decided it was time for us to get to the bathrooms and get to bed. Everybody was a little creeped out, so we all went as a group to the bathroom. I washed up and brushed my teeth first, there was a large trough-style sink outside of the actual bathroom, so I was one of the last to actually go to the toilets. As I was in there, I heard someone moving around in the stall next to me. I said something to her, asked for TP? Who knows, but she didn't answer me. I said hello twice, but I still got no answer. When I finished, I knocked on the other stall door, but nobody answered even though I could still hear noises inside and the door was locked. I went out and told one of the counselors who went back in with me to check it out. When we went in, the door was unlocked and there was nobody in there. There was no other way out of the bathroom besides the front entrance that I was standing no more than 2 feet from when I was talking to the counselor. The girls that were in the tents that were kind of separated from the others were a little freaked out, and they didn't want to sleep out there, but since they were right next to the counselor's tent, they were reassured and sent to bed. When we reached our tent, we saw that again there was someone in the spare bunk. This time we figured one of the girls from the far tent had snuck over in spite of what the counselors had said. And really, do you think any of us had enough balls to lift the blanket off of that bed? We settled in for the night, and I was wishing that I could fall asleep so that I didn't have to be awake alone. Soon enough I could hear the snores of the other girls, and I was still staring at the ceiling of the tent. Soon enough, I heard the springs of one of the beds squeak again. I opened my eyes and stared at what was supposed to be our vacant cot. There was someone standing up again. I could just make out the figure standing there in the dark. It stood there for about 30 seconds this time before it moved across the tent and out the flaps. Needless to say, I was pretty much shitting myself, but I was too scared to scream for a counselor because I was afraid that whatever it was would come back. I laid awake for what seemed like hours staring at the tent flap, hoping that it wouldn't open again. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember it was morning. Again, the cot was empty. This time I told the counselors what I had seen, and they asked the girls at breakfast who had been in our tent, but none of the girls admitted to being there. All of the girls in my tent had seen the figure on the cot both nights, but I was the only one who had seen it leave. That day was pretty sedate because everyone was a bit on edge, but we eventually relaxed because of the bright sunshine and fun activities. In order to keep our minds off of it that evening, the counselors planned for us to have a bunch of snacks and games around the campfire that night. We had stuff for the little hand pies, banana boats, s'mores, and cinnamon apples. We were all planning on making absolute pigs out of ourselves. The counselors set up all the goodies in the picnic shelter, which was 30 to 40 feet from the campfire ring. The girls would go over and set up their snack and bring it back to the fire to cook it. When I went over, there were a few girls finishing up their snacks, and they left before I had finished up making my banana boat. As I was adding my chocolate chips, there was a huge bang like a gunshot in the woods, and it was followed by yells that seemed to be coming from different directions. I dropped my snack and went running over to the fire. Everyone had heard it, and some of the girls were near tears. As we sat there, we heard more noises and yells from the woods. The fire was in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by woods, and it was an awful feeling to realize how exposed we were and that anybody could be out in the woods watching us. Instead of going to the latrines that night, a lot of the girls just did their business behind the tents, and the girls that were in the far tent were moved into our tents. In fact, we consolidated into 2 or 3 tents by adding cots, and the counselors slept in the 4th tent. We were packed in like sardines, but everyone would sleep easier with more people nearby. We also propped up one of the flashlights on the floor to illuminate the tent as we slept. I actually fell asleep pretty quickly that night because I had had 2 sleepless nights before. But I ended up waking up at some point in the night because of some noises. I opened my eyes, but I found that the tent was now dark. It seemed that the flashlight had died at some point, and as I managed to get my bearings, I realized that the noise I was hearing was the sound of someone getting up out of one of the cots. I nearly stopped breathing as I watched the figure stand. I had to shift my head this time to get a better look. It stood in one place even longer this time, and I couldn't stop watching. It seemed to be leaning over and looking at some of the other girls, and it started to make its way between the cots towards the front flaps. As it neared my cot, I snapped my eyes shut and tried to slow my breathing. Pretending I was sleeping, I could hear it come even with my bed, and it stood there for a long time. I presume it was staring at me, but I wasn't about to open my eyes and find out. Eventually, it moved past me, and I heard the sound of the tent flap being opened. I still kept my eyes shut tight because I was so afraid that it was trying to trick me. That's when I heard the most god-awful noise I've ever heard. One of the posters in the other thread posted a video of cats talking, and I have to say that was pretty accurate, but it was much louder. It didn't sound like a human or an animal. The sound seemed to be coming from outside of our tent but nearby, but all of a sudden, the girls in the next tent started screaming like they were being murdered. Of course, our tent responded in kind, and all of our flashlights were switched on in rapid succession. We could hear the other girls still screaming and running out of their tent. We all stumbled out of our tent to see what the hell was going on. By the time we made it out, most of those girls were near the fire pit, and the counselors were headed for them. From what the girls were able to relate, they heard the horrible noise outside, and that's when they saw someone, or something, enter their tent. In all of the confusion, nobody saw exactly what had entered, but they had seen the figure open the tent flap. The counselors tried to console the girls, and the one that was particularly brave took a flashlight and headed toward the tent. She searched the tent, but she couldn't find anyone or anything. We spent the rest of the night all jammed in a group near the fire, and not a single one of us got any sleep. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave early after one of the counselors discovered that the door to the dining hall had been opened, and things had been moved around. Nobody but the counselors had access to the dining hall, and the doors had been padlocked the night before.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.